What's the scariest thing you've ever witnessed? Story 1. My father is a physician, has been in practice for 30 years, and has literally seen tens of thousands of patients. One day a few years back, he went to see a woman who had been admitted to the hospital the previous day for a serious lung condition. He entered her hospital room in the morning. The woman was heavily sedated, and there was a nurse fixing her bed and cleaning the room. Immediately upon entering, my father had a severe allergic reaction, felt like he could barely breathe, and tears started rolling from his eyes. The nurse stood up and helped him back into the hallway. After my dad finally recovered and apologized to the nurse, he said that it was so weird and that it only happened when he got close to cats. The nurse went white as a ghost. It turned out that the hospitalized woman had been awake all night, screaming that cats were crawling all over her body and trying to scratch out her eyes. The hospital staff believed she was simply having a strange reaction to some medication, and after hours of her terrified screaming, they were able to medicate her to sleep. There is probably a logical explanation for the whole situation, but I remember finding the account bone-chilling when I first heard the story. Story 2. Scariest moment. I was about 16 or so, and on my way to help decorate for a school dance. A buddy and I decided to go get some snacks and drinks for everyone, and he was driving his hatchback Camaro from the 1990s. About halfway down the road while heading back with the snacks, we were coming around a fairly sharp right curve, and halfway through the curve, a truck came blasting toward us, half on our side of the road. My friend swerved and overcorrected a few times until we were heading semi-straight on the road, not realizing we were still sliding a bit toward the ditch. He tried to save it, and we hit the ditch on the driver's side while still moving fairly quickly. The last thing I remember before blacking out was us in midair careening into the ditch. The car was mangled and upside down, facing the opposite direction we were heading, and both of us were hanging upside down in our seats. He was still unconscious, and his head was tilted sideways against the roof. I had to crawl through the broken window on the back hatch because the doors were crushed. There was a man standing across the road who just happened to live right across from where we crashed. He said we hit the ditch, flipped, and the top of the car was crushed on a tree before rolling back down into the ditch upside down. I had a mild concussion, and he cracked a bone in his neck but was not paralyzed. We were extremely lucky. I still get nervous when riding as a passenger. Most bone-chilling. The day I had to use all the training in cardiopulmonary resuscitation I never imagined I would ever need. Working at a grocery store, I heard a woman screaming about something in one of the aisles. Another woman came running toward the front, panicked and asking if anyone knew cardiopulmonary resuscitation because a man had collapsed and was not breathing. I closed my lane with people still in line and met a pharmacist who worked there halfway to the man. The two of us were the only ones trained, and we worked for about 30 minutes, switching every few minutes when one of us got exhausted. A woman came back a few days later to the store and told us she was a relative of his and that he did not make it, but she thanked us for trying so hard to keep him alive until the paramedics arrived. I still remember it like it is fresh in my mind. Story 3. I work in mental health, particularly with people who have extensive suicidal ideation and multiple psychiatric hospitalizations. Despite working with this population for close to 10 years, I have only had one client successfully end their own life. They poured gasoline over themselves and set themselves on fire. There are no words for how extremely terrifying that was to witness. The worst part was that they did not immediately pass away, and I will hear them say that it was not what they wanted for the rest of my life. All of my clients live in their own apartments, and the criteria for being accepted into my program is multiple psychiatric hospitalizations. But once they are on the team, we do not encourage hospitalization, which can be a double-edged sword. Story 4. I never thought I would share this story with total strangers, but here it goes. My mother, my sister, and I lived in a small apartment, and an important thing to note is that my mother was a psychiatrist who later lost her license after attempting to kill a patient, so she had a very large collection of painkillers, psychedelic substances, and more. It was my sister's 13th birthday party, and my mother decided to drink an entire bottle of cough syrup, enough vodka to kill most people, and probably something else as well. It got to be about 11 at night, and my sister started making plans for her and her friends to sleep in the living room. At that point, my mother started trying to flirt with some of her friends and demanded to sleep right next to them. My sister said no and was slapped across the face so hard I could hear it clearly through my bedroom door. The next thing I knew, my sister grabbed the phone and told me to call the police and my father while she started barricading my door with her body. She screamed that she would burn the whole house down if she had to, as my mother broke my door while holding a large knife. All I had time to do was tell the police that we needed help at our address before she pointed the knife at me and told me to give her the phone. My sister then grabbed the phone, screaming for help, as my mother grabbed her by the throat, lifted her up, and pressed her against my window. Luckily for us, the police station was about a 5-minute walk from our home, so officers arrived after about 10 minutes of our bedroom standoff. As soon as we saw the police lights outside the window, my mother dropped my sister and locked herself in her room. I have never been able to forget the look in her eyes as she pointed the knife at me, and it still gives me nightmares years later. I would like to say we got a happy ending, but my father was much the same as my mother, so my sister and I were separated and both ended up homeless. I found some very good friends I now call family who took me in, but my sister was not so lucky, and I have not seen her in about a year now because her husband is abusing her even though she insists he is perfect. Story 5, I was on the jury for a trial where a 70-year-old drunk driver hit and killed a motorcyclist after making an illegal turn. The police testified against him, all the evidence was against him, and the case itself was very clear and straightforward. We went into deliberations after both parties had rested, and one woman on the jury refused to convict him on the most serious charge simply because he was old. She conceded on the lesser charges but refused to change her vote on the main one, insisting that she was doing everyone a favor by making sure he was only convicted on reduced charges. We sat there for hours trying to reason with her and explain the impact of the decision, but she would not budge. Eventually, a fellow male juror switched sides because he just wanted to go home. Then someone else said they were hungry and did not want to sit there any longer, so they gave up as well. Slowly, more people switched, and in the end, the jury could not come to a unanimous decision and could not convict him on the major crime. I will never forget the look on the motorcyclist's wife's face as she cried, his parents sitting there in disbelief before they also started crying, and his young daughter just sitting quietly, not saying a single word. Story 6. When I was around 8 years old, I got on a roller coaster at Six Flags in Houston. It had those foam-covered bars that locked over your shoulders and a small seat to sit on, while your feet dangled freely. About a minute into the ride, it started twisting, and I slipped halfway out of the seat and almost completely out of the seatbelt, which was supposed to be checked for safety beforehand, but clearly was not tight enough. I spent the entire ride digging my small nails into the foam padding on the shoulder bars, while the sharp edge of the seat dug painfully into my back. My mom was sitting next to me and noticed what was happening, but all she could reach was my shirt, which she held onto as tightly as she could for the rest of the ride. I remember being absolutely terrified and convinced that I was going to fall out. I have never been on a roller coaster since that day. Story 7, I am a veterinarian, and I used to work emergency shifts at night, and one time a woman called saying her dog was bleeding from his nose. I advised them to come in immediately, although they did not sound extremely distressed on the phone, just mildly concerned. I went to unlock the practice and their car pulled up. The woman and her husband were there, and the woman stepped out of the car smiling and thanking me for coming in so late. She then walked around to the trunk where the dog was, and the moment she opened it, she let out a completely soul-destroying scream. I ran over, and all I could see was this poor spaniel lying in a sea of blood, with the entire trunk completely covered in it. It turned out that a blood vessel in the dog's lungs had eroded, most likely related to an undiagnosed cancer, as the dog had shown no serious signs of illness before, aside from being slightly more lethargic. During the drive over, the dog had essentially bled out through his respiratory tract and was already dead by the time they arrived. I have never heard such raw and tragic screams in my life, and they will haunt me for as long as I live. I spent 2 hours with the devastated family, consoling them and talking about their dog as he had been when he was alive. I have never been so disturbed by a single sound as I was when that woman began screaming, because of how sudden and shocking it all was. Story 8. For the abusive person that he was, my dad did go through some terrible experiences. I am not sure how the conversation started, but my mom eventually told me this story. Back in 1992, a lot of people did not care about seatbelt safety, and some even actively protested against it. One young mother learned the hardest possible lesson about why seatbelts matter. My dad worked as a cross-country delivery driver in a semi-truck, and he was driving down the highway when a car suddenly swerved out of its lane directly into a head-on collision with his truck. If you have ever seen the aftermath of a car colliding with a semi-truck, you already know how this usually ends. Miraculously, the mother survived. Her own mother, the little girl's grandmother, died either from the impact or possibly from a heart attack. The worst part was that the mother had not buckled her 5-year-old daughter into the back seat. When the crash happened, the little girl was thrown through the windshield and did not hit the ground for a solid 10 feet. She was dead on impact, and that woman now has to live the rest of her life knowing that one simple act of neglect is the reason her daughter is gone. Story 9. When I was about 12 years old, my sibling broke down late one night and told my mother that they had been touched by our grandfather. That night, my siblings, my mother, and I cried together in a pile for hours, and it remains one of the worst nights of my life. The next day, we stayed home from school, but my mom still had to go to work since there was no dad in our lives. We lived in a semi-underground apartment where the windows on one side of the house were almost level with the ground outside. At some point, we heard a knock and recognized my grandfather's voice asking us to let him in. We were absolutely terrified and ran to close all the blinds and lock the back door. He was an exceptional manipulator and put on the sweetest, saddest grandfather voice imaginable, knocking on every window and pleading with us to let him inside. None of us spoke, and we hid while whispering to our mom on the phone that he was there trying to get into the apartment. He tried opening the door, and when he realized it was locked, he became angry, quietly shouting about how we could do this to him, how he loved us, and how nothing was wrong. After about 10 minutes, he left, though it felt like hours, and my mom rushed home as fast as she possibly could. Sometime later, whether the next day or not long after, my grandparents' house was searched by the police, and they discovered that he had set up a tube running from a closet in his private study, which no one else was ever allowed to enter, into the bathroom so that he could secretly watch us use the bathroom and shower for an unknown amount of time. The only piece of good news is that he did go to prison, though only for 3 years. And even now, we are sometimes forced to see him at unavoidable family gatherings like funerals, which makes my skin crawl. I have been mugged at gunpoint and nearly kidnapped in Mexico when I was 13 years old. But my grandfather trying to get into our home that day remains the most terrified I have ever been in my entire life. Story 10. In 1996, at the age of 19, I went on an interrail trip around Europe with my boyfriend at the time. It was the best trip ever and cost next to nothing compared to what I spend on holidays now with my 2 children. At one point, we were on the Greek island of Corfu, since some ferry routes fell under the interrail system, and we hired small 50 cubic centimeter mopeds for a couple of days so we could explore the island. One night, at around 11:30 in the evening, the sky was extremely dark because of heavy clouds, and we were heading back to our hostel via a very steep and very winding mountain road with sheer cliff drops along the side. That alone was frightening enough, but then a truck suddenly came tearing around a blind bend toward us on the wrong side of the road, with its lights on full beam, completely blinding me. I tried to pull over so he would not hit me, but I skidded and went straight off the edge of the cliff at roughly 30 miles per hour. I have an incredibly vivid memory of the sensation of flying and falling, while my heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that it felt deafening. I remember holding my breath the entire time this was happening, although my boyfriend later told me that I was actually screaming. Then it felt as though I blacked out or fell asleep, because what seemed like centuries later, I opened my eyes and saw nothing but darkness and heard absolutely nothing. I remember thinking that at least dying did not hurt, and then immediately realizing that I was still thinking, which confused me because I expected everything to just stop. I thought maybe it would end in a moment. Maybe this was it. And I waited, and waited, knowing it was inevitable and that I could do nothing to change what was coming. That was the single scariest moment of my entire life. Eventually, I heard distant shouting in another language and noticed tiny specks of white light above me. And then I realized I could see stars and street lights along the shore below. The truck driver and a few other men were yelling in Greek, and my boyfriend was screaming my name. I was alive, hanging almost completely upside down, caught by my backpack, straps in a tree growing out of the side of the cliff. It took a long time for them to reach me and pull me to safety, and the moped rental shop was extremely angry about the loss of their moped. I have ridden one again since, but only very briefly. My family has never been told this story because they would probably lock my now 40-year-old self in a cellar even today, just to make sure I could never do anything that reckless again. Story 11. This happened about a month ago when I picked up my sister from a party. I was driving us home when I noticed a black car ahead of me going about 15 miles per hour, flashing its brake lights, turning on its left indicator signal, but then making right turns. Growing impatient, I decided to illegally cut him off so I could just get home. As soon as I did, he sped up and began flashing his fog lights, signaling for me to pull over. I ignored him and kept driving, already feeling creeped out. My house was only a couple of miles away, but the route had a lot of turns, and this guy kept tailgating me and aggressively following me, which became genuinely terrifying. I ended up driving roughly 50 miles within a radius of maybe 10 miles, just trying to lose him. Eventually, I made a sudden left turn where he could not follow without risking a collision with another car. I quickly pulled over and turned off all my lights, holding my breath as I watched his car slowly drive past, desperately hoping he would not notice me. After about 15 minutes, I looked around carefully and then drove home slowly. My sister was drunk and asleep the entire time, so she had no idea any of this even happened. Story 12. The scariest moment of my life was having to come face to face with the place where my brother committed suicide. Growing up, I always had serious trust issues, so whenever a relative passed away, I felt mostly numb because I never allowed myself to become too attached. That did not apply to my immediate family, though, because they had my complete trust and love. My brother took his own life by drowning himself in a local lake, and by the time my family was notified, it had already been 4 to 5 hours. When I arrived at the scene, I was so scared and shaken that I had to keep confirming to myself that it was real and not some kind of nightmare. All logic completely disappeared as I found myself asking a police officer what the chances were that my brother might still be alive, even though I knew it had been hours since he went into the water. I was 25 years old at the time. I had to force myself to hold everything together and comfort my parents with false hope, telling them that it was probably misinformation and that we should wait, even though I knew deep down it was not true. I will never forget that moment when all logic vanished and raw emotion completely took over. Story 13. My group of friends used to play a game we called Run. We would play late at night, usually starting around 1 in the morning, when the streets were completely empty since our town was very small. We would walk down to Main Street and stand outside the post office or the grocery store, hanging out, talking nonsense, and passing time until the local police officer drove by. We would wait just long enough for him to see us, and then we would all scatter and run in different directions, with the officer chasing us through town for the rest of the night. As long as we stopped if he turned on his lights or siren, we never got into trouble, and we did this often enough that the police seemed to enjoy the game as much as we did. Sometimes they would even get out of the car and chase us on foot, and it was always exhilarating. One night we were playing until around 4 in the morning when the birds started singing and the sky began to turn gray, so we decided to head home. As we were walking along a road parallel to the main highway, we suddenly heard a massive boom that sounded like a bomb going off. We ran toward the sound as fast as we could and found a truck that had plowed directly into the side of a local auto parts store. There were no police or emergency services there yet, and this was before mobile phones, so one of my friends ran to the nearest house to call emergency services, while the rest of us cautiously approached the vehicle to check on the driver. What we saw is still hard to describe, because it looked as though the lower half of the man's body remained in the driver's seat, while his upper half had shifted toward the passenger side, leaving him in 2 pieces. What shocked me most was how disturbingly ordinary it looked, because unlike movies, there was no dramatic music or lighting, just a mangled body sitting there. A few seconds later, tribal police from a casino about 40 minutes away arrived with their sirens on, followed shortly by local police, ambulances, and the fire department. We later learned the man had stolen money from the casino and was being chased, and because it had been raining and there was a sharp curve near the store, he lost control, jumped the curb, and slammed sideways into the building. The most disturbing part was how the entire town came out to watch, with people standing on lawns and sidewalks for hours trying to glimpse the body. And when volunteers held up sheets and tarps, others climbed onto rooftops to look from above. A man had died in a brutal and horrific way, and all anyone seemed to care about was seeing his corpse. Story 14. I once witnessed the aftermath of a bar fight. One small drunk man kept pushing a much larger sober man for no apparent reason. The larger man eventually knocked him out with a single punch, and from what I heard, it was a vicious hit. I found the injured man lying between two pool tables, and he had hit his head badly when he fell backward, causing it to bleed heavily. He was completely unconscious and would not respond to any of my attempts to wake him while we waited for the ambulance. The way he was breathing was the most disturbing thing I have ever seen, as his body seemed to be in pure survival mode just to keep his lungs moving air. His breathing was harsh and forceful, and blood was pouring from his mouth because several of his teeth had been knocked out. When emergency medical services finally arrived and took him away, I could barely look at him anymore, because seeing someone in such a helpless state was overwhelming. The poor man had even lost control of his bladder. I later found out that he had to be airlifted to a larger hospital because he had bleeding on the brain. Although he apparently recovered and eventually went back to his old ways, I never want to witness someone in that condition ever again. Story 15. During Hurricane Katrina, I was living just outside Jackson, Mississippi. My grandmother and cousin, who lived closer to the coast, had come to stay with us because we believed we would be fine since no hurricane had ever caused significant damage that far north. As the storm picked up badly, we stood in the carport watching the pine trees across the street bending dangerously, repeatedly saying that they looked like they were about to fall. We eventually went back inside, and I started listening to music very loudly on my compact disc player. Out of nowhere, I saw something pink and foamy fall from the ceiling and land directly on my cousin's face, and she screamed louder than I had ever heard anyone scream before. I looked at my dad and saw him silently mouth the word "run." I jumped up, turned around, and saw a tree branch less than 1 foot behind where my head had just been, sticking through the window. The massive oak tree in our backyard had fallen directly onto our house. The only reason I'm alive is because the tree was forked and fell in just the right way to wedge itself against our chimney instead of crushing the room entirely. Story 16. While snowboarding in Colorado, my friend and I were doing laps in the terrain park, and one of the jumps had become too large for the landing, meaning that if you hit it too slowly, you would end up landing far beyond the intended slope. My friend and I went over it, and I landed on the flat area beyond the landing. While we were riding the lift back up, maybe 10 meters away from the jump, I pointed out and said that we should not hit it again because it was unsafe. Not even 5 seconds later, a skier came flying down with a lot of speed, hit the jump cleanly, cleared the landing, cleared the flat section, and actually landed on the takeoff of the next jump. For context, these were not small jumps, roughly 10 to 15 meters each, with about 6 in a row. He landed on an almost vertical surface relative to his direction of travel. What followed was the loudest, most horrifying, bone-snapping sound I have ever heard. A clean break of his femur, followed immediately by a sickening, blood-curdling scream. We watched from about 15 meters away, completely helpless. By the time we reached the top, we alerted ski patrol, and when we got back down to him, he was being helped by other people in the terrain park and was still screaming in agony. Story 17. The scariest moment of my life was when I nearly fell asleep at the wheel while driving home from my ex-girlfriend's house. On weekends, I would pick her up from work and we would go out, but she usually had to be home around 2 or 3 in the morning. One night, I was already exhausted because I had been awake since 6 in the morning, but I still had to drive her home, or she would get in serious trouble with her parents. I struggled to stay awake during the drive, which was about 20 minutes each way, but she stayed awake and talked to me to help keep me alert. After I dropped her off, she told me to drive safely, pull over if I could not make it home, and to call her once I arrived safely. About 10 minutes from my house, I reached the point where I could barely keep my eyes half open. I slapped myself in the face several times to wake myself up and kept driving because I thought I was close enough. At some point, while still driving and occasionally hitting myself to stay awake, I suddenly realized that I had somehow parked my car very poorly on a main street. I had absolutely no memory of driving to that street, which was several blocks past where I would normally turn to go home, or of how I had even managed to park the car. It terrified me because I had essentially driven on autopilot in the middle of the night with no other cars around. I decided immediately to send my ex a message saying I was going to take a nap in my car. I did not wake up until 9 in the morning, and the only reason I woke up was because a police officer knocked on my window to check on me. Story 18. One time my sister and I were waiting for the bus when a man on the other side of the road suddenly started shouting at us. He was dirty, dressed in rags, and looked extremely unstable and angry. There were cars passing by, but he did not seem to care as he dodged between them and started making his way directly toward us. Fortunately, the bus arrived at that exact moment, and we got inside as soon as the doors opened. We immediately told the driver to close the doors, and just as he did, the man reached the bus and began banging aggressively on the door. The driver quickly understood the situation and drove off. The last thing we saw was the man still shouting and running after the bus as it pulled away. Everything happened so fast that we were left in shock for a while, and what scared us the most was that we had no idea who he was or why he seemed so intent on attacking us. Story 19. When I was younger, the neighborhood boys and I went through a phase where we were obsessed with climbing trees, big or small, getting together and climbing everything we could find around the area. When my mom found out, she forbade me from doing it and warned me that I was going to hurt myself. Being a kid, I naturally ignored her, thinking that as long as I was careful, I could never really get hurt. I remember one day when the boys and I got together and started climbing my friend's huge oak tree in his backyard. I had climbed it many times before, and it was my favorite because it overlooked his two-story house. What made that day different was the fact that it had rained only a few hours earlier, so the branches were wet. I made it all the way to the top and then turned around to climb back down toward my friends at the bottom when I suddenly lost my footing and fell. It happened so fast that there was literally no time to feel fear. I fell headfirst from the top of the tree, missing almost every branch on the way down until the very last one, about 6 feet from the ground. As I was falling, my legs buckled, and I somehow managed to catch myself on that final branch. Hanging there upside down, staring at the ground below, all I could think was how unbelievably close I had come to disaster as the adrenaline hit me all at once. To this day, I am convinced I would have died or broken my neck that day, which I actually did break 3 years later. But that is another story entirely. Story 20, I broke my neck in 6th grade during gym class. We were in the gymnastics unit, and I was doing a headstand while my friend held me for support. Since I was a heavier kid, there was already a lot of pressure on my neck, but my friend thought it would be funny to push me during the already painful process. All of my weight shifted onto my neck, and I heard 3 distinct popping sounds. When I stood up, my neck was twisted all the way to the left and would not move back. Surprisingly, it did not hurt that badly at first, and I stumbled around in confusion. My gym teacher came over and told me to do a forward roll. I complained about my neck, but he kept insisting. Thankfully, the female gym teacher noticed that something was seriously wrong and told me to sit down. After class ended, the pain started to set in, and when I began crying in reading class, my teacher immediately sent me to the nurse, and an ambulance was called because of the seriousness of neck injuries. At the hospital, the doctor ordered a computed tomography scan, and I was taken to a room to wait for the results. I will never forget my mom breaking down in tears when the doctor walked in with a grim expression and explained that I had a subluxation of my first and second cervical vertebrae, a hairline fracture in my first cervical vertebra, and that almost all of the ligaments in my neck were torn. When my mom started sobbing, everything suddenly felt very real. Surgery was considered extremely risky, and there was a chance I might never walk again. Fortunately, I had an incredible doctor who decided against surgery and instead placed me in traction, which involved inserting large screws into my head while I was awake and attaching weights to realign my neck. I stayed in the hospital for just under a week and recovered surprisingly quickly with very few long-term effects. I had to wear a brace for 6 months while the fracture and ligaments healed, and rehabilitation was extremely difficult. But 10 years later, I have full movement in my neck. The doctor later told us that if I had done that forward roll like the coach wanted, I would have been paralyzed for the rest of my life. Story 21, I cannot say that I was terrified, but I was definitely shaken. I went shopping at the small strip mall in my town, and while I was browsing in one store, I noticed a man walking past me. I nodded politely, smiled, and went back to shopping. After leaving that store, I needed to stop by the supermarket that served as the main anchor store for the strip. As I approached my vehicle after leaving the department store, I noticed that the same man was sitting in a truck parked next to mine, which I assumed was just a coincidence. I drove to the supermarket at the other end, went inside to grab what I needed, and returned to my vehicle, only to see that he was parked next to me again. As I climbed into my van, I noticed an unusually large container of petroleum jelly inside his truck, and a moment later it became clear that the man was engaging in inappropriate behavior while looking directly at me. I calmly looked away and called my husband, who was working the night shift as a police officer, and explained the situation, including the man's appearance, his vehicle, and our location. Within less than 30 seconds, all 4 officers on duty in our very small town arrived, including my husband. They sent me home and detained the man. I was relieved to leave, but later learned that he was mentally challenged, though still capable of holding a driver's license, and that his mother, who had been his primary human connection, had passed away only a couple of weeks earlier. I understand now that he may have been acting out of grief, though it still left me deeply unsettled. He was not charged that night but was taken to a mental health facility for evaluation, and I never heard about him again. As for truly bone-chilling experiences, I have had many from my time as a legal secretary, especially the hours spent transcribing murderers' statements. Most cases were disturbingly routine, involving domestic violence or crimes of passion. But one case still haunts me, where I had to transcribe a recording of 2 young men begging for their lives while sitting fully clothed in an empty bathtub. The recording continued as several teenagers and a couple of men in their 20s mocked the bodies after killing them, describing in graphic detail what happens naturally after death, and discussing plans to weigh the bodies down and dispose of them in a lake. That recording resurfaced only because the camera operator's partner turned it in. The cries and pleading of those 2 young men have never left my mind, and I quit my job the following week because I could not handle it anymore. Story 22. This actually happened to me recently. I had posted it a few weeks earlier in another discussion and copied it over. I am currently going through a very nasty divorce. I left my wife about 4 months ago and moved into a house by myself close to work. We have a 4.5-year-old daughter whom I had not been able to see for the past 4 months because my wife filed an injunction against me, even though nothing had happened and it was purely a divorce tactic. Thankfully, she eventually came to her senses and dropped the injunction, and now I have a 50-50 timeshare with my daughter starting next weekend. This past weekend, my mom came to town to help me set up the house because she believes that men have absolutely no sense of decor, and when it comes to me, she is probably right. We bought a twin bed for my daughter's room, got her Frozen-themed furniture and decorations since it is her favorite movie, and filled the house with small decorative items, candles, pictures, artificial plants, rugs, and anything else we could think of to make the place feel more like a home. Before buying the new rugs and setting up my daughter's room, I had kept my cat's litter box in that room for the past 4 months while it was empty. After finishing the room, I moved the litter box into another empty bedroom, but my cat did not accept that change at all and apparently decided that my daughter's room was her territory. She refused to use the litter box and instead relieved herself on the brand new carpets every time my mom and I left the house. So the entire weekend consisted of deep cleaning the rugs with strong cleaning products over and over again. Eventually, I gave up and moved the litter box back into my daughter's room, which is right next to my bedroom, until I could figure out a better solution. This detail matters. On Monday afternoon, my mom had a flight at 6 in the evening, so we went out for one last meal, and then I dropped her off at the airport. I got home around 6:30 to my newly furnished and decorated house, And for the first time in months, it actually felt comforting. I had no plans that night, so I spent the evening on the couch watching movies and drinking scotch. Around 11:30, I was very drunk, stumbled into my bedroom, closed and locked the door out of habit, and passed out almost immediately. Around 4:30 in the morning, I woke up to the worst smell I have ever experienced. So bad that it dragged me out of my drunken sleep. It smelled like an unholy mix of waste, sweat, rot, and something indescribably foul. My first thought was that my cat had used the rug again. I rolled over and tried to ignore it, but the smell was overpowering. I finally got up, unlocked the door, and checked the living room, which was clean. I checked my daughter's room and found a fresh mess in the litter box, so the smell could not have been coming from the cat. Confused, I locked my door again and lay in bed staring into the darkness for about 30 minutes, trying to make sense of it. I wondered if it was a combination of cleaning chemicals, waste, or maybe trash I had forgotten to take out, but nothing made sense. A little after 5 in the morning, I went to the bathroom, sat down, scrolled on my phone for a bit, flushed the toilet, and collapsed back onto my bed. As I lay there listening to the toilet finish draining, the house fell completely silent, and then I heard it, a sniff and the sound of someone clearing their throat coming from my closet. Instantly, my body went into pure survival mode. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, unlocked the door, grabbed my keys, ran out the front door, and jumped into my car. I backed out of my driveway, pulled into my neighbor's driveway across the street, aimed my headlights at my house, and called the police. They arrived within minutes. I told them there was someone in my closet, and since I sleep unclothed, they initially thought I was just an intoxicated man panicking, but after a brief argument, they went inside to check. After what felt like forever, they came back out with a very thin, clearly homeless man in handcuffs. The officers explained that he had entered through the back sliding glass door while I was dropping my mom off at the airport, admitted he was looking for pills or items to sell for pills, and hid in my closet when he heard me come home. The smell I had been waking up to was his body odor coming from 3 feet away all night. The thought that this man was in my house the entire night, so close to me, still makes me shiver, especially when I think about what could have happened if my daughter had been there. Story 23, I do not know if this experience was truly bone-chilling, but it is permanently burned into my memory. When I was in high school, I went to Colorado with some friends, and we decided to climb a small mountain near the hotel where we were staying. If you followed the trail, which was more like a deer path, it was a very easy hike, but being young and reckless, we chose to go the hard way. That meant scrambling along a cliff face that was roughly 100 to 200 feet high for most of the climb. We were having an amazing time, taking pictures along the edge, when we spotted a rocky outcropping hanging over the cliff that overlooked a beautiful valley between mountain ranges. Naturally, we decided we had to get there. We found what we thought was the easiest route down, but the problem was that to reach it, you had to jump down about 6 or 7 feet and clear a 4-foot gap with nothing but open air beneath you for hundreds of feet. No one else was brave enough to try, so I took the jump and made it without any trouble. We took the photo, and then I had to figure out how to get back up. Since jumping straight up was impossible, I had to free climb my way back. Everything was going fine until I ran out of hand and footholds, and the next one was around a corner directly over open air. With no other option, I reached for it and managed to get a decent grip, then started moving my body around the corner. As I shifted my weight, my hands slipped and I started falling. My mind went completely blank, and I remember calmly accepting that this was how I was going to die. Somehow, I landed on a tiny ledge sticking out from the cliff, maybe 2 feet by 1 foot in size. I had fallen about 15 feet and somehow stuck the landing. I climbed back up as fast as I could, and it was not until I reached the top and sat there shaking that it fully hit me how close I had come to dying. I fell off a cliff purely because I was being careless and stupid. Story 24, I was the victim of an extreme road rage incident. I am a small 26-year-old woman driving a compact car. Around 7 in the morning during winter, on a narrow mountain county road, a massive pickup truck decided I was driving too slowly. He began accelerating toward me as if he was going to hit my car, then at the last second illegally passed me on a blind turn. He pulled in front of me and slammed on his brakes, and I barely avoided crashing into him. We sat there for a moment, and then he started revving his engine aggressively. Suddenly, he put the truck in reverse and tried to hit my car. I panicked, screamed, and reversed as well, and we both started driving backward down the mountain road. I used my hands-free system to call emergency services, but I was screaming so badly that the operator could barely understand me. After roughly 100 yards of reversing, he stopped. I stopped as well, though I do not know why. As I started explaining what was happening to the operator, the man got out of his truck holding a weapon and ran toward me. I screamed again. In the distance, another car appeared, and the man immediately turned around, jumped back into his truck, and sped away. I have never been so terrified in my life, and I truly believed I was about to be killed. The fear stayed with me for hours, leaving me shaking and crying uncontrollably. And to this day, I refuse to drive on that road ever again. Story 25. I was volunteering at a race and was in the middle of handing out cups of sports drink to thousands of exhausted runners who had just finished and were shuffling past me. I was facing them to give out the cups, so I was looking back down the race course toward the finish line about 50 feet away. Suddenly, there was a massive boom, and I saw a huge puff of smoke. Everyone jumped because it was incredibly loud, and all the hundreds of faces that had been looking at me a second earlier instantly turned the other way. The cloud of smoke rolled up the side of a nearby church, and there was this eerie moment of silence while everyone stared at it, followed by a strange, distant, high-pitched sound where you could almost feel everyone thinking the same thing. Then there was a second boom, and the distant sound turned into a wave of screaming, raw, desperate, blood-curdling screams. The noise built in volume over a couple of seconds, rising to this unbearable pitch of pure terror that triggered something primal in my brain, and suddenly every single one of those thousands of runners who had barely been able to walk moments earlier launched forward at once and started sprinting past me. The sight of that entire crowd exploding into motion in perfect synchrony, hundreds of faces whipping back toward me as every person pushed off into a full sprint, is something I will never forget. All the volunteers around me ran as well. Everyone ran except me and one other volunteer and the police. The officers who had been standing nearby talking instantly turned and ran toward the explosions without hesitation, something I had never seen before. Seconds later, a wheelchair came racing toward us, surrounded by people, pushed by a pale-faced volunteer, with a man sitting in it who appeared to have his legs folded under him while holding two red sticks out in front of him. It was not until he had already passed me that I realized the red sticks were his shin bones and that his legs had been destroyed. He was the first of many people who lost limbs, followed by hundreds more with severe injuries. This happened 4 years ago in Boston, and it still lives vividly in my mind. Story 26. This experience was different, but it was the most scared I have ever been and the closest I have come to death. I was riding a motorcycle alone, moving at a spirited pace on a remote forested mountain road that is well known among riders. I came around a blind but fast corner at roughly 70 miles per hour and was instantly confronted by a herd of around 20 elk crossing directly in front of me. I could not even see the road on the other side of them, just a solid wall of massive animals weighing hundreds of pounds and standing over 6 feet tall. I had just enough time to close my eyes. At that speed, it would have taken more than 200 feet to stop, and I had maybe 20 feet with no clear path through. Somehow, and I will never know exactly how, I passed through completely unharmed. I remember hearing their hooves striking the pavement as I went by. I pulled over immediately, turned off my bike, got off, and sat on the side of the road shaking uncontrollably for about 30 minutes. When I finally calmed down enough, I rode home very slowly. I have never ridden that road again, and I never ride without a helmet camera now. For context, I have ridden hundreds of thousands of miles and have crashed several times in the past, but nothing has ever come close to the terror of that moment. Story 27. This is something that affected me so deeply that I cannot even remember how old I was. Only that I was in elementary school, and it was before 4th grade. I actually have more memories from before kindergarten than I do from the years between kindergarten and 4th grade, and this is the clearest one. I woke up to my mother screaming hysterically and walked out of my bedroom to see what was happening, only to watch her collapse onto the floor holding my infant brother. He had died from sudden infant death syndrome sometime during the night. My father grabbed my other brother and me, rushed us into the car, while my mother got in still sobbing and desperately attempting resuscitation as we sped toward the nearest fire station. Years later, when I was pregnant with my third child, the fear returned in a way I never expected. I became convinced that if the baby was a boy, he would die just like my brother, and the terror became so overwhelming that I was suicidal. I truly believed it would be easier to die than to live through losing my child. I was referred to counseling and had my first session just hours before my anatomy scan, where you find out the baby's S, and I learned I was having a boy. For the rest of my pregnancy, I refused to buy anything except his bed, and we bought diapers on the way home from the hospital. I stopped breastfeeding so I could take stronger medication and was placed on multiple prescriptions that only barely kept me from acting on my thoughts. I struggled to bond with my son, was afraid to get attached, and even convinced myself that he hated me despite him being so attached that no one but me could hold him without him screaming. The only memory I had of my brother being alive was from Christmas, so I convinced myself that if my son survived past Christmas, I could finally stop worrying. After that holiday, I stopped taking my medication. Things slowly improved, though not completely, and he just had his first birthday a couple of weeks ago. I am no longer afraid to love him, though I still have panic attacks whenever we drive past fire stations. Story 28. I was 19 years old and working in a farm supply store. We had truck drivers who came in regularly to load supplies, and most of the time we knew them fairly well. There was one man in particular who was always a little shady and inappropriate. One day he came into the store while I happened to be completely alone because there was a crisis at one of the grain mills. I heard the bell jingle when someone entered and turned to head toward the front desk, only to see him walking directly down the aisle toward me. He did not say a word, and he did not need to. I knew exactly what he was thinking and what he intended to do. I have never before or since been so certain of someone's intentions. I was trapped on three sides, and he outweighed me by at least 100 to 150 pounds and stood at least 6 inches taller than me. When he was about 8 feet away, the face of our young, very fit, and physically imposing manager suddenly appeared over his shoulder from across the store. He shouted the man's name once, just once. I immediately knew that the manager understood exactly what was happening, whether from the look on my face or from knowing something about the man's past. The man turned toward him, and the manager calmly told him he would help him. He met him halfway across the store and escorted him out the door. I do not know what was said, but the man who had been a regular customer for years never returned. The manager checked to see if I was okay, told me the man was no longer welcome, and then we both quietly went back to work. It was terrifying and surreal because everyone involved knew exactly what was happening without a single word being spoken. Story 29. I was once at a fast food restaurant near the border between Mexico and the United States at around 2 to 3 in the morning. I was sitting alone at a table, and the place was crowded. While I was eating, two men sat down across from me. I did not think much of it at first, assuming they were just looking for a place to sit. But the man closest to me, a heavy-set bald man with tattoos on his arms and neck, leaned in and said something along the lines of, telling me I should never have come there and that he could easily put me in his trunk and no one would ever know. The feeling of fear that hit me in that moment was immediate and overwhelming. I knew that if I showed fear or lost my composure, something very bad could happen. That was when I noticed the words Nueva Generación tattooed on his neck. I tried to think of what to say for what felt like an eternity, and all I managed was to tell him that he might regret it. He and his friend laughed, stood up, and walked out of the restaurant. I know now that they were likely just trying to intimidate me for amusement, but it remains one of the most frightening moments of my life, and I have avoided going near the border ever since. Story 30. This happened when I was 7 years old, and it was probably the first time in my life that I truly believed I was going to die. My family went on a long road trip to my mother's hometown, a small fishing village that depended on tourism during the summer. It was a beautiful place by the ocean, with scenery that felt unreal, but the water itself was extremely cold and dangerous. Early one morning, we went on a whale watching trip, And during the excursion, we were caught in a massive ocean storm. The captain had decades of experience at sea, yet even he could not guarantee that we would make it back to shore. I remember being absolutely terrified and shaking uncontrollably. My father took the time to explain to me what death was, and told me that sometimes it was not something people could fight if it was unavoidable. I was raised without religious beliefs, so there was no comfort in ideas of heaven or an afterlife. The fear stayed with me as the boat was tossed around for hours, rising and falling in the water. What feels the most chilling to me now as an adult is realizing that my entire family was there together. My grandmother, my cousins, my aunts and uncles, my parents, my dog, and even my best friend at the time. If something had gone wrong, an entire family could have been lost in a single moment, wiped away without a trace. Story 31. I work in a healthcare type setting, and one of the most terrifying things I have experienced involved a client who suffers from seizures. During these episodes, their tongue would bleed, their eyes would look as if they were about to pop out of their skull, and the first time I witnessed it, I was called over to help. I had to keep them positioned on their side so they would not choke on their own blood and support them so they would not fall out of or tip their wheelchair. I remember looking into their eyes while gently playing with their hair in an attempt to calm them, and watching another person's pupils dilate until all you could see was black, while their eyes turned bloodshot, was absolutely horrifying to me. At certain points, they would also stop breathing entirely. The entire experience was overwhelming and had me on the verge of tears. A coworker of mine experienced something equally traumatic when a client began choking and could not cough the obstruction back up. An ambulance was called. Staff attempted to create an airway so the person could breathe. There was blood everywhere, and despite their efforts, they were unable to save them. That person died on the floor in front of my coworker and several other staff members. I am intentionally being vague and avoiding details like gender to protect the identities involved in case a family member ever comes across this. Outside of work, another deeply disturbing experience involved an old roommate who caused our house to be raided by authorities. I had a gun pointed at me and later learned he had been downloading illegal material involving minors. At first we were in denial, thinking it might have been an accident involving someone who looked older, but when I spoke to the detective and learned the actual ages involved, I completely broke down. It was terrifying to realize someone I thought I knew was capable of doing something like that just down the hall from me. It destroyed my sense of safety, made me fearful of having children, and I struggled to even go out in public for about a month afterward. Story 32. Years ago, I lived next door to a very reclusive, alcoholic, middle-aged father and his young adult son. They shared a basement studio apartment in a very old building with paper-thin walls, and they would stay up until all hours of the night, screaming at each other in Korean and throwing things against the walls. Ironically, if I made even the slightest noise in my own apartment, such as closing kitchen cabinets or turning on the sink, they would bang on my walls, scream at me, and sometimes open their door to yell down the hallway at mine. I already had anxiety, and living next to them made it unbearable. One morning, a package was delivered early and left in front of my door. It was not large, but something about it seemed to set the father off. I woke up later to hysterical howling and violent banging that sounded like cracking wood, and to my horror, it was coming from inside my apartment. I ran into the living room in my pajamas, half asleep, and saw my front door barely hanging on, splintered at the frame, as my neighbor repeatedly threw his body into it, trying to kick it down. I could see the cracks spreading along the frame with every impact. I was a 5'1", 20-year-old woman, home alone, unarmed and completely defenseless, and I genuinely believed that if he got inside, he was going to kill me. Suddenly he stopped, went back into his apartment, and acted as if nothing had happened. I spent the rest of the day hiding in my closet, crying on the phone with my boyfriend at the time. I moved out not long after. Story 33. I was deep sea diving near a derelict oil rig off the coast of Florida, about 60 feet underwater, where the light begins to fade into darkness. Looking up, the water was a rich blue, but looking down, it was pure black, and I could not see where the legs of the rig ended as they disappeared into the depths, my mind imagining they went on forever. My dive partner began dropping small shells and pebbles he had collected, and after a few minutes, enormous shadows started rising from below. One was a sunfish, which looks like a disembodied head, and there were also several oarfish. The sunfish was as tall as I am, 5 feet 9 inches, and the oarfish were at least twice that length. The sunfish swam directly up to me and opened its mouth in my direction, its strange face unsettling, while the fins of the oarfish brushed against my legs through my wetsuit. I could feel adrenaline flooding my body as I started to feel warm despite the cold water. My partner grabbed my buoyancy vest and shoved my dive computer in front of my face to show me that I was burning through air at an alarming rate. The fish were only curious, but they were so alien, and being surrounded by heavy gear while the water compressed my body made it intensely claustrophobic and frightening. I earned my master diver certification that day. Story 34. Watching my cat die was one of the most painful and unsettling experiences of my life. I adopted him when he was barely 8 weeks old, and he lived to be 15 years old. He was my best friend, a soulmate in the sense of companionship, and we grew up and changed together. He passed away recently in mid-March of this year. His kidneys were failing, though we did not know it at first, because he had been acting completely normal, eating, drinking, and sleeping as usual. One night he got into a fight with one of my roommate's cats and afterward began urinating small amounts of blood. We assumed he had injured himself in the fight, since he was no longer young. It was around 11 in the evening, but thankfully we lived close to a 24-hour emergency veterinary clinic, so we rushed him there. Tests later that night revealed the fight was unrelated and that his kidneys were failing. The veterinarian explained that animals can sometimes sense illness in others of their species and may act out to draw attention to it, something they had seen before. He deteriorated rapidly over the next 24 hours, becoming visibly exhausted, and I had to make the decision to have him put to sleep. I stayed with him to say goodbye and comfort him, and when the medication was administered, he passed almost instantly. Watching the life fade from his beautiful heterochromatic eyes in less than a second was one of the most haunting things I have ever seen. Even writing this is incredibly painful. I miss him deeply. I miss you, Iris. Story 35. This was without question the most bone-chilling moment of my life. When I was younger, around 13 or 14, some friends and I were out drinking beers in a local park and open field. It was a large area with lots of small wooded sections and wildly overgrown patches. Around 11:30 at night, we ran out of beer and decided to head home. It was autumn, pitch dark, and that park could feel genuinely unsettling at night, especially given the things that had happened there in the past, including murders, assaults, and muggings. As we walked, we kept hearing voices in the distance, but never from one clear direction. As we got deeper into the park, the voices became louder and more distinct, coming from the far side of a heavily overgrown clearing. We could see a small campfire, along with 2 caravans and trucks parked nearby, since the park was a common stopping place for Irish travelers. I do not remember exactly what they were saying, but we were all deeply unnerved. In our infinite wisdom, we decided to cut through a wooded area to go around the clearing, which sat between us and the exit we needed. As we moved through the trees, snapping branches and making noise, the voices suddenly stopped. We froze. Total silence. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. All of us were locked in place, convinced we were about to be attacked. Then we heard a scream, a horrific, gut-wrenching scream that sounded like someone was being killed. It made every one of us jump out of our skin. Staring toward the campfire, we saw what appeared to be a headless body lying near the fire, with what looked like a head a short distance away. Somehow we decided to move toward it, creeping out of the trees toward the campfire, partially shielded by the glare of a truck light. As we got closer, the firelight revealed the truth. The body was a rolled-up sleeping bag with a jumper draped over it. The head was a rugby ball, and the scream had been a fox. It was simply a group of travelers sitting around a fire. Those minutes of slowly approaching what we thought was a corpse remained the most bone-chilling moments of my life. Story 36. I have seen a lot of disturbing things growing up. One year, my family was cultivating land in our backyard to expand our garden. And while digging where we planned to plant corn, we uncovered an old gun buried in the soil. That same year, our mother and stepfather went out of town for a couple of days to attend a concert. My eldest brother had a deeply traumatic childhood from very early on, including saving our mother's life by making an emergency call at the age of 3